What happens when the world stops laughing and starts watching in complete silence? When mockery turns to awe in just 3.7 seconds. Picture this. A woman stands before thousands of skeptical eyes, her hands steady despite the weight of every doubt ever cast upon her. The target sits impossibly far away, 45,000 meters of pure challenge stretching between her and a moment that would rewrite everything anyone thought they knew about human potential. They came to watch her fail. They stayed to witness history. This isn't just a story about precision. This is about the moment when every person who ever said impossible had to swallow their words. It's about the tears that followed the silence, the apologies that came too late, and the life that changed forever with one perfect shot. Some stories are born from luck. Others from years of hidden sacrifice that nobody wanted to see. This is the story of Sarah Chen, the woman they called crazy until she proved them all wrong in the most spectacular way imaginable. Sarah Chen never expected her Tuesday morning coffee to taste like courage. But there she was, staring at the acceptance letter that would change everything. The International Precision Championship had finally responded to her application, the same application her colleagues at the engineering firm had mocked for months. "You're seriously applying for that?" Her supervisor, Marcus Webb, had laughed when he caught her filling out the forms during lunch break. "Sarah, come on, you're a good engineer, but this is the big leagues. These people have been training since they were kids." The letter in her hands proved otherwise. After 3 years of weekend practice sessions at the local range, countless hours of studying wind patterns and trajectory mathematics, she had earned her spot among the world's elite marksmen. But the path to this moment hadn't been smooth, and the doubts of others were nothing compared to the doubts she carried within herself. Growing up in a small town outside Seattle, Sarah had always been different. While other kids played video games, she spent hours in her father's workshop, fascinated by the precision required for his clockmaking business. David Chen, a quiet immigrant from Taiwan, taught his daughter that perfection wasn't about being naturally gifted. It was about understanding every tiny detail that others overlooked. "See this spring?" he would say, holding up a piece no bigger than a grain of rice. "If it's off by even 1 millimeter, the whole clock fails. But get it right, and it runs for generations." Those lessons stuck with Sarah long after her father's sudden heart attack when she was 16. The workshop fell silent, the clock stopped ticking, and Sarah threw herself into her studies to escape the grief. She graduated top of her engineering class, landed a good job, and built what everyone considered a successful life. But something was missing. That precision her father had taught her to pursue. 3 years ago, she'd walked into Thompson's shooting range on a whim. The elderly owner, Frank Thompson, had been skeptical when this slight Asian woman asked about precision shooting lessons. "Most folks come here to blow off steam," Frank had said, eyeing her carefully. "But you've got that look, that focus. What's your story?" Sarah had surprised herself by telling him everything about her father, the clocks, the endless pursuit of perfection that had driven her since childhood. Frank listened without interruption, then handed her a rifle that had seen better days. "Let's see what you've got," he'd said simply. Her first shot missed the target completely. The second hit the outer ring, but by her 10th shot, something clicked. The same precision that helped her design bridge supports and calculate stress loads suddenly applied to wind resistance and bullet trajectory. Frank's weathered face broke into a grin. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered. "You've got the math brain for this." What followed were 3 years of intensive training that her co-workers knew nothing about. Every weekend, every vacation day, Sarah spent at the range. She studied ballistics textbooks the way other people read novels. She learned about breathing techniques from a retired Marine, studied weather patterns with an obsession that bordered on madness, and gradually worked her way up from 100-meter targets to distances that made other shooters shake their heads. The breakthrough came 18 months ago during a local competition. Sarah had been competing in the intermediate division, consistently placing in the top 3 but never winning. The weather that day was terrible, crosswinds gusting unpredictably, light rain that made visibility challenging. Other competitors were complaining, adjusting their scopes constantly, and missing shots they would normally make easily. But Sarah thrived in the chaos. She'd spent months studying how moisture affected bullet flight, how wind patterns changed with temperature shifts. While others fought the conditions, she worked with them. When the results were announced, she hadn't just won, she'd set a new range record. That's when Marcus Webb first heard about her little hobby. "You're kidding me," he'd said when she mentioned taking a personal day for a shooting competition.
"Sarah, you barely speak up in meetings. You're telling me you're some kind of sharpshooter? The mockery had stung, but it also fueled her determination.
She began entering larger competitions, traveling to neighboring states on weekends. Her apartment filled with trophies that she never mentioned at work. Her precision scores climbed higher and higher, catching the attention of coaches and former champions. But it was the day she met Elena Vasquez that everything changed. Elena was a former Olympic shooter, now coaching elite athletes. She'd been observing a regional championship where Sarah was competing. After Sarah's victory, a commanding win in challenging conditions, Elena approached her. "I've been watching you," Elena said without preamble. "Your technique is unorthodox, but your results speak for themselves. Tell me, what's the farthest distance you've successfully shot?" Sarah had been working up to longer distances gradually, her engineering background helping her understand the complex mathematics involved.
Consistently? About 2,500 meters.
"But I've been studying the calculations for much longer shots." Elena's eyes lit up. The International Championship has categories most people don't even know about. Ultra-long distance precision. We're talking targets at distances where most people can't even see what they're aiming at. Would you be interested? That conversation had led to 6 months of the most intensive training of Sarah's life. Elena pushed her beyond every limit she thought she had. They worked with equipment that cost more than Sarah's car, studying atmospheric conditions that affected bullets over enormous distances. Sarah learned about mirage effects, the Coriolis effect of Earth's rotation, and how to calculate trajectories that took several seconds to complete. The training was physically and mentally exhausting. Sarah would arrive at work with shoulders aching from hours of holding perfect shooting positions. She lost weight, gained muscle, and developed a focus so intense that her coworkers began commenting on how different she seemed. "You're like a different person lately," her cubicle neighbor Jenny had observed. "More confident or something. What's your secret?" But Sarah kept her training private. She'd learned that people reacted with either disbelief or uncomfortable jokes when she mentioned competitive shooting. It was easier to let them think she'd taken up yoga or meditation. The application to the International Championship had been Elena's idea. The ultra-long distance category had only existed for 5 years, and most competitors were former military snipers or people who'd been shooting professionally for decades. When Sarah read the requirements, demonstrating ability to hit targets at distances exceeding 40,000 meters, she'd initially laughed. "Elena, that's almost impossible. The physics alone. The physics are challenging." Elena had corrected, "But not impossible. You understand mathematics better than most shooters ever will. You've been training for precision your entire life, just in different ways. Trust me on this." The qualification process had been grueling. Sarah had to demonstrate her abilities to a panel of judges, submit videos of her shooting at various distances, and complete written examinations on ballistics and safety protocols. When the acceptance letter finally arrived, she'd stared at it for 10 minutes before the reality sank in. She was going to compete against the world's best marksmen in a discipline that pushed the absolute limits of human precision. But first, she had to tell her coworkers she'd be taking 2 weeks off for the championship. The conversation with Marcus had gone exactly as she'd expected. "So you're telling me," he'd said, leaning back in his chair with a smirk, "that you've been secretly training to become some kind of super sniper, and now you're competing internationally?" "Precision shooting," Sarah had corrected quietly. And yes, the laughter that followed had echoed through the office. Within an hour, everyone knew about Sarah's delusions of grandeur. The jokes started immediately, co-workers making shooting gestures when she walked by, leaving toy water guns on her desk, asking if she needed a cape for her superhero activities. But Sarah had learned to channel criticism into motivation. Each joke, each dismissive comment, became fuel for her training. She spent her final weeks before the championship in intense preparation, working with Elena on the specific challenges they'd face at the event. The championship was being held in Nevada, at a facility specifically designed for extreme distance shooting. The targets for the ultra-long distance category were positioned at distances that seemed almost surreal, the farthest at 45,000 meters, nearly 28 miles away. At that distance, Earth's curvature became a factor in calculations. "Remember," Elena told her during their final training session, "everyone there will underestimate you. You're young, relatively unknown, and you don't fit their image of what a precision shooter should look like. Use that advantage." Sarah packed her equipment with the methodical care her father had taught her. Every tool had its place, every calculation double-checked. She carried with her not just the technical knowledge she'd accumulated, but the memory of every person who had doubted her abilities. The night before leaving for Nevada, she stood in her apartment surrounded by the trophies and certificates that documented her journey. 3 years ago, she'd been just another engineer, going through the motions of life. Now she was about to compete on the world's biggest stage in a discipline that demanded absolute perfection. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Don't forget to send us a postcard from Fantasyland." Sarah smiled as she turned off the lights. Tomorrow she would begin proving that sometimes the most unlikely people are capable of the most extraordinary things. The woman they'd laughed at was about to show them what real precision looked like. The Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a sky so clear it seemed fake. Sarah arrived at the championship facility with Elena, both women carrying equipment cases that represented 3 years of preparation and sacrifice. The facility itself was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, a sprawling complex of ranges designed to test human precision at distances that challenged the very limits of physics and technology. Other competitors were already arriving, and Sarah felt the weight of their stares immediately. Most were men, many clearly former military, all carrying themselves with the confidence of people who'd been doing this their entire lives. She overheard fragments of conversations, discussions of previous championships, mentions of world records, casual references to shots that would have been impossible dreams just a few years ago. "First time here?" asked a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see a tall, weathered man in his 50s extending a hand. "Name's Robert Kellner. Been doing this for about 15 years. "And Sarah Chen," she replied, shaking his hand. "Yes, it's my first international competition." Robert's eyebrows raised slightly. Bold choice, jumping straight into ultra-long distance. Most people work their way up through the shorter categories first. "What's your experience?" Before Sarah could answer, another competitor joined the conversation, a younger man with perfectly styled hair and expensive-looking equipment. "This is cute," he said with a condescending smile. "Are you somebody's daughter? Here to watch Dad compete?" Elena stepped forward, her expression dangerous. "She's here to compete, same as you. And if I were you, I'd be more worried about my own performance than commenting on other people's qualifications." The man laughed. "Come on, coach. No offense, but look around. This isn't exactly beginner's night at the local range. The ultra-long category requires experience most people spend decades building." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand the requirements. That's why I qualified. Page." The man seemed genuinely surprised. "What division have you been competing in?" "Regional championships, mostly. Some state-level competitions." Sarah knew how modest this sounded compared to the international experience most competitors brought. The laughter that followed attracted attention from other nearby competitors. Word spread quickly through the group. The unknown Asian woman was attempting ultra-long distance as her first international competition. The reactions ranged from amused disbelief to genuine concern for her safety. But Robert Kellner didn't join the laughter. He studied Sarah with the calculating eyes of someone who'd learned not to judge ability by appearance. "What's your longest successful shot?" he asked quietly. "Consistently?" "About 3,200 meters in competition conditions." Robert nodded slowly. "That's respectable. But we're talking about distances up to 45,000 meters. Here, that's a different universe of challenges. Wind patterns change multiple times along the bullet's path. You're dealing with atmospheric pressure variations, temperature gradients, even Earth's rotation becomes significant." "I've studied the mathematics," Sarah said simply, "and I've been training specifically for those conditions." "Mathematics are important," agreed another competitor who joined the circle. "But experience matters too. I've been shooting ultra-long distance for 8 years, and I still learn something new at every competition. The theoretical knowledge is just the foundation." Sarah understood what they were really saying, that she didn't belong here. The same message she'd heard from her coworkers, just delivered with more politeness. But she also sensed that some, like Robert, were genuinely trying to help rather than dismiss her. The opening ceremonies that evening showcased the elite nature of the competition. Competitors from 23 countries, many with military or Olympic backgrounds. Sarah sat with Elena in the back of the auditorium, listening to introductions that detailed achievements she could barely imagine. World record holders, former special forces operators, people who'd been featured in documentaries about extreme marksmanship. When her name was called as part of the ultra-long distance category, The applause was polite but brief. The announcer mentioned her regional wins but had little else to say about her background. She was clearly the unknown quantity in a field of established champions. After the ceremony, Elena found a quiet corner where they could talk privately. How are you feeling about tomorrow?
Sarah considered the question honestly.
Nervous, but not about the shooting itself. I'm nervous about proving I deserve to be here.
You've already proven that by qualifying.
Elena reminded her. Tomorrow is just about executing what you've trained for. Remember, you have advantages these people don't recognize. Your engineering background gives you mathematical insights most shooters develop through years of trial and error. You understand the physics intuitively. That night, Sarah lay in her hotel room staring at the ceiling, her mind running through calculations and scenarios. The ultra-long distance competition would take place over 3 days, with distances increasing each day. Day 1, 25,000 meters. Day 2, 35,000 meters. Day 3, 45,000 meters. Each competitor would have 3 shots at each distance, with scoring based on precision rather than just hitting the target. The mathematics were staggering. At 45,000 meters, a bullet would take over 7 seconds to reach its target. Wind conditions could change multiple times during that flight. Temperature variations along the bullet's path would affect its trajectory. Even the Earth's rotation would deflect the bullet by several inches during its journey. But Sarah had spent months preparing for exactly these challenges. She'd studied weather patterns specific to the Nevada desert, learned to read atmospheric conditions that most people would never notice, and developed mathematical models that accounted for variables other shooters handled through instinct and experience. The first day of competition dawned crisp and clear. Sarah arrived at the Grange early, spending time with her equipment and studying the conditions. The 25,000-meter targets were barely visible even through high-powered scopes, appearing as tiny dots against the desert backdrop. She watched the first few competitors, noting their techniques and results. Most were shooting well. This was, after all, the World Championship level. But she also noticed something interesting. Several of the more experienced shooters seemed to be struggling with the desert conditions, making adjustments based on experience from other locations that didn't quite apply here. When her turn came, Sarah felt a familiar calm settle over her. This was the state she'd learned to achieve during thousands of hours of practice, a mental space where mathematics, physics, and instinct merged into pure focus. She positioned herself carefully, checked her equipment one final time, and began her calculations. Wind at the firing position, 3.2 miles per hour from the southwest. But her weather monitoring equipment showed different conditions at various points along the bullet's path. Temperature gradient indicated rising air masses that would affect trajectory. Barometric pressure was stable but slightly lower than she'd trained for. She made micro-adjustments to her scope, factoring in variables that most shooters would approximate or ignore entirely. Her first shot felt perfect the moment she released it. The recoil was exactly what she expected, the follow-through clean. 7.5 seconds later, the spotters confirmed what Sarah already knew: dead center hit. A murmur went through the watching crowd. Beginner's luck, someone muttered. But Sarah's second shot, adjusted for the slight wind change she'd detected, struck within millimeters of the first. Her third shot formed a triangle so tight that the spotters needed high-powered optics to confirm it was actually 3 separate hits. The official scorer announced her results with undisguised surprise. Not only had she hit the target with all 3 shots, she'd achieved the tightest grouping of the day so far. Robert Kellner approached her as she packed her equipment. "That was impressive shooting," he said without a trace of condescension, "especially for these conditions. How did you read that wind pattern so accurately?" Sarah appreciated his genuine interest. "I've been studying desert meteorology for months. The way air masses behave here is different from most other shooting locations. Plus, I set up weather monitoring equipment at multiple points along the range." "Smart approach." Robert nodded. "Most of us rely more on feel and experience. Your engineering background is showing." But not everyone was impressed by her performance. The expensively equipped competitor from the previous day approached with a skeptical expression. "Nice shooting," he said in a tone that suggested he meant the opposite. "Though 25,000 meters is just the warm-up. Wait until we get to the real distances." Sarah simply nodded politely, but Elena's response was more direct. "We'll be ready for whatever distances you can handle." The second day brought new challenges. At 35,000 meters, the targets were invisible to the naked eye, appearing only as faint dots through the most powerful scopes. The bullet flight time increased to over 6 seconds, and environmental factors became even more critical. Sarah had spent the previous evening analyzing data from her first day's shooting, fine-tuning her mathematical models based on actual observed conditions. She'd also noticed something that might give her an advantage, a subtle atmospheric phenomenon that occurred in this specific location during late morning hours. When competition began, she watched other shooters struggle with conditions that seemed to confuse even experienced competitors. The desert air was creating mirage effects that made traditional aiming techniques unreliable. Several champions who dominated at shorter distances were missing targets entirely. But Sarah's engineering training had taught her to see patterns where others saw chaos. The mirage effects weren't random, they followed predictable patterns based on ground temperature and solar heating. She'd mapped these patterns during her early morning reconnaissance, noting how they shifted throughout the day. Her first shot at 35,000 meters took nearly 4 seconds of calculation before she felt confident in her setup. She accounted for the mirage effect, adjusted for the increased wind differential at this distance, and factored in the barometric pressure change that had occurred since the previous day. The shot felt different from anything she'd attempted before. At this distance, she was pushing beyond the limits of her previous experience, relying on theoretical knowledge and mathematical modeling rather than muscle memory and practiced instinct. 6.3 seconds of silence followed her shot. Then the spotter's voice crackled through the radio. Impact, dead center. The murmur from watching competitors was louder this time. This wasn't beginner's luck anymore. Sarah's second and third shots were equally precise, creating another impossibly tight grouping that had the range officials double-checking their scoring equipment. By the end of day 2, Sarah was leading the overall competition. The mathematical precision that had made her colleagues laugh was now making world-class shooters take notice. Conversations around the facility had shifted from dismissive amusement to genuine curiosity about her techniques. That evening, a small group of competitors approached Sarah and Elena at dinner. Robert Kellner spoke for the group. "We've been talking and we're all curious about your approach. None of us have seen someone apply mathematical modeling to this degree. Would you be willing to share some insights?" Sarah hesitated, glancing at Elena. These were her competitors, after all. But Elena nodded encouragingly. The shooting community is generally pretty open about sharing knowledge. It elevates everyone's performance. Sarah spent the next hour explaining her approach, the weather monitoring equipment, the mathematical models she'd developed, the way she'd studied atmospheric conditions specific to this location. The group listened with the focused attention of professionals recognizing expertise in an unexpected form. "It's brilliant," admitted one competitor who'd been skeptical earlier. "Most of us develop intuition for these factors through years of experience, but you've created systematic ways to quantify what we usually just feel." But even as Sarah gained respect from fellow competitors, she knew the real test was still ahead. The final day would feature the 45,000-meter target, a distance that pushed the absolute limits of precision shooting. At nearly 28 miles, environmental factors became exponentially more complex. Even the best shooters in the world sometimes failed to hit the target at all at this distance. Sarah spent that night in final preparation, reviewing every calculation, checking every piece of equipment, visualizing the shot sequence she'd practiced hundreds of times. Tomorrow would determine whether she was truly ready for this level of competition, or whether her critics had been right about her limitations. The woman who'd been laughed at by her coworkers was now just one day away from either the greatest triumph or most public failure of her life. Everything she'd worked for, every hour of training, every mathematical calculation, every moment of doubt she'd overcome, it all came down to 3 shots at a distance that seemed to defy human capability. As she finally fell asleep, Sarah's last conscious thought was of her father's workshop, the sound of precisely calibrated clockwork, and the lesson he'd taught her about perfection being found in the smallest details that others overlooked. The third day of competition arrived with weather conditions that made even veteran meteorologists nervous. Wind patterns were shifting unpredictably, creating challenges that would test every competitor's ability to adapt. At 45,000 meters, these conditions would transform an already extreme challenge into something that pushed the boundaries of human capability. Sarah arrived at the Grange before dawn, setting up her weather monitoring equipment while most competitors were still sleeping. Elena found her there 2 hours later, completely absorbed in data analysis that covered 3 laptop screens and several handwritten calculation sheets. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked, settling beside her with coffee for both of them. "Like I'm about to find out if 3 years of preparation were enough," Sarah replied honestly. "The wind data is showing patterns I've never seen before. It's almost like there are multiple weather systems interacting along the bullet's path." Elena studied the data displays. "Can you model it?" "I think so. It's just more complex than anything I've calculated before. But that might actually work in my favor. Sarah pointed to one of her screens. Most shooters will try to time their shots for calmer conditions. But I think I can predict when these complex patterns will stabilize briefly. Word had spread through the shooting community about Sarah's performance in the first 2 days. The range was more crowded than usual, with spectators who'd driven from nearby cities to witness what some were calling the most unpredictable championship in years. Media representatives were also present, drawn by the story of the unknown engineer challenging the world's elite marksman. Sarah overheard fragments of conversations as she prepared her equipment. Some spectators were genuinely curious about her techniques. Others remained skeptical, suggesting that her success at shorter distances wouldn't translate to the ultimate challenge of 45,000 meters. 28 miles, one photographer was explaining to his assistant. At that distance, you can't even see the target without high-powered optics. The bullet takes over 7 seconds to get there. In that time, wind conditions can change 3 or 4 times along the flight path. The competition format for the final day was simple but brutal. Each competitor would have 3 shots at the 45,000 meter target. Scoring would be based on precision, with points awarded for proximity to the target center. Miss the target entirely, and you scored 0 for that shot. Sarah watched the first few competitors with growing understanding of just how difficult this challenge was. These were world-class shooters, people who dominated international competitions for years. Yet even they were struggling with the conditions. One former world record holder missed the target completely with his first shot, then overcorrected and missed on the opposite side with his second. Robert Kellner, shooting in the position just before Sarah's turn, managed to hit the target with 2 of his 3 shots. A respectable performance that earned respectable applause from the crowd. But even his hits were several feet from the target center, illustrating just how precisely the extreme distance magnified every tiny error. Then it was Sarah's turn. She approached the firing position with her equipment cases, moving with the deliberate calm she'd practiced thousands of times. The crowd quieted as she began her setup routine. Unlike most competitors who relied primarily on traditional scopes and instinctive adjustments, Sarah's preparation looked more like a scientific experiment. She positioned multiple weather monitoring devices, connected laptop computers to her scope systems, and began what looked like complex mathematical calculations. To watching spectators, it appeared almost absurdly over-engineered compared to the more traditional approaches of other shooters. "What is she doing?" someone in the crowd asked loudly enough for Sarah to hear. "Applying engineering principles to an art form," Elena answered from the sideline. "Some people might call it overthinking. I call it precision." Sarah's calculations took nearly 15 minutes, longer than most competitors spent on all 3 of their shots combined. She was modeling wind patterns at 12 different points along the bullet's 45,000 meter path, factoring in temperature gradients, barometric pressure changes, and even the slight effect of Earth's rotation on such an extreme distance shot. But she was also incorporating something most other shooters couldn't access: her ability to recognize mathematical patterns in seemingly chaotic data. The swirling wind conditions that looked unpredictable to others showed clear cyclical patterns to her engineering-trained eye. Finally, she settled into her shooting position. The crowd fell completely silent. Even competitors who'd finished their attempts moved closer to observe. Everyone present understood they were about to witness something extraordinary, whether it was spectacular success or dramatic failure. Sarah controlled her breathing, feeling her heart rate slow to the rhythm she'd trained to achieve. Through her scope, the target appeared as a tiny dot that seemed to shimmer and dance in the desert heat. At this distance, even the most minor error in aim would send the bullet yards away from the intended point of impact. Her finger found the trigger with the light touch her father had taught her when adjusting delicate clockwork mechanisms. The mathematical models in her mind, aligned with instinctive feel, developed through thousands of practice shots. Everything she'd learned, every hour she'd trained, every calculation she'd mastered, focused down to this single moment. The shot surprised even her with its perfection. The recoil felt exactly right, the follow-through smooth and natural. But now came the longest 7 seconds of her life, waiting for the bullet to complete its nearly half-minute journey through constantly shifting atmospheric conditions. The silence was absolute. Several hundred people held their breath as if their stillness could somehow guide the bullet to its target. Sarah remained in position, scope still trained on the distant target, waiting for the spotter's call that would determine whether 3 years of preparation had been enough. 7.2 seconds after her shot, the spotter's voice crackled through the radio system, audible to the entire crowd. "Impact, dead center. Perfect hit." The silence continued for another heartbeat before exploding into applause that echoed across the desert. Sarah remained motionless, hardly believing what she'd heard. A perfect hit at 45,000 meters was rare even for the most experienced competitors. For someone in her first international competition, it was almost unthinkable. But she still had 2 more shots to complete. The second shot required new calculations. Wind patterns had shifted slightly during the 10 minutes since her first attempt, and atmospheric pressure was changing as the desert heated under the climbing sun. Sarah updated her models, made microscopic adjustments to her scope settings, and settled into position again. This time, the crowd remained silent throughout her preparation. Word was spreading beyond the immediate spectators. Text messages and social media posts were beginning to carry news of the unknown competitor who'd just achieved what most considered impossible. Her second shot felt even better than the first. Sarah knew immediately that her calculations had been correct, her adjustments perfect. When the spotter confirmed another dead center hit, the applause was even louder than before. But it was her third shot that would become legendary. By now, news crews were arriving, drawn by reports of an extraordinary performance unfolding at the championship. Television cameras captured Sarah's methodical preparation, her complex calculations, and the focused intensity that had carried her through 3 years of training toward this moment. The wind conditions for her final shot were the most challenging yet. Multiple weather systems were creating crosswinds that changed direction at different altitudes along the bullet's path. Traditional shooting wisdom would suggest waiting for calmer conditions, but Sarah's analysis indicated that the complex pattern was actually becoming more predictable as the system stabilized. She made adjustments that seemed counterintuitive to watching competitors, aiming in a direction that appeared to be completely wrong for the visible wind conditions at the firing position. But her mathematical models accounted for wind changes that would occur at distances beyond what most people could even conceptualize. The third shot's preparation took longer than the first 2, with Sarah fine-tuning calculations until she achieved the mathematical precision her engineering background demanded. When she finally settled into her shooting position, the crowd was larger than at any point during the competition. The shot felt perfect the instant she released it. 7 seconds of silence followed, during which the only sound was desert wind and the quiet hum of electronic equipment. Then the spotter's voice filled with disbelief even as he made the official call. Impact, dead center. Another perfect hit. The crowd erupted in applause that lasted several minutes. Sarah finally rose from her shooting position, hardly believing what had just happened. 3 shots at 45,000 meters. 3 perfect hits. At a distance where many world-class shooters were grateful just to hit the target at all, she had achieved precision that some observers were already calling the greatest shooting performance they'd ever witnessed. Elena reached her first, tears streaming down her face as she embraced her student. "I've been coaching for 20 years, she whispered. "I've never seen anything like that." Robert Kellner was among the first competitors to congratulate her, his earlier skepticism completely replaced by genuine admiration. "That wasn't just great shooting," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "That was applied physics at a level most of us can't even understand." But it was the reaction from the competitor who'd mocked her on the first day that Sarah found most satisfying. He approached with genuine humility, extending his hand and saying simply, "I owe you an apology. What you just did, I've been shooting for 15 years, and I couldn't have made one of those shots, let alone 3. The official results were almost anticlimactic. Sarah hadn't just won the ultra-long distance category. She'd set a new world record for precision at 45,000 meters. Her 3-shot grouping was tighter than anything previously recorded at that distance. Media interviews followed, with reporters struggling to understand how someone with no formal shooting background had achieved such extraordinary results. Sarah tried to explain her mathematical approach, but she could see that most journalists were more interested in the human interest story than the technical details. "How does it feel to prove all your doubters wrong?" one reporter asked. Sarah considered the question carefully. "It feels good to validate the approach," she said finally. "But mostly it feels like confirmation that precision is achievable when you understand all the variables involved." The flight back to Seattle gave Sarah time to process what had happened. 3 years ago, she'd been a quietly competent engineer going through the motions of a predictable life. Now she was returning home as a world record holder in one of the most challenging precision disciplines ever developed. But it wasn't until she walked back into her office the following Monday that the real satisfaction hit her. Marcus Webb looked up from his desk as she approached, his expression uncertain. News of her achievement had reached the office through various channels, and everyone seemed unsure how to react to the dramatic reversal of their expectations. "So," Marcus said carefully, I saw some news articles over the weekend. Congratulations, I guess. Sarah smiled politely and set a printed photograph on his desk, herself holding the championship trophy with the 45,000-meter target visible in the distant background. Thank you, she said simply. It turns out precision shooting and engineering have more in common than most people realize. The office was quieter than usual for the next few weeks. The toy water guns disappeared from desks. The jokes stopped completely. Colleagues who'd mocked her hobby now asked respectful questions about her training and techniques, but the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. Colleagues who'd mocked her hobby now asked respectful questions. Jenny, her cubicle neighbor, approached her during lunch one day with a nervous expression. "I've been thinking about what you did," Jenny said. "Not just the shooting, but the whole thing. Working towards something you believed in even when everyone thought you were crazy. I've had this idea for a business for years, but I've been too scared to try it because people keep telling me it won't work." Sarah smiled. "What kind of business?" As Jenny explained her concept, a service matching elderly people with technology tutors, Sarah recognized the same spark she'd felt when she first walked into Frank Thompson's shooting range. The desire to pursue something meaningful despite the doubts of others. "You should try it," Sarah said firmly. "The worst thing that can happen is that you'll learn something. The best thing is that you might discover capabilities you didn't know you had." 6 months later, Jenny's business was thriving, and she credited Sarah's example as the inspiration to take the leap. Other coworkers began pursuing their own abandoned dreams. Art classes, music lessons, entrepreneurial ventures they'd shelved because of fear or criticism. Sarah continued competing, winning additional championships, and setting new records. But she also began coaching other shooters, sharing the mathematical approaches that had revolutionized her own performance. Elena partnered with her to develop training programs that combined traditional shooting techniques with engineering-based precision analysis. The shooting range where she'd first discovered her talent became a pilgrimage site for precision shooting enthusiasts. Frank Thompson, now in his 70s, enjoyed telling visitors about the quiet engineer who'd walked in 3 years earlier and asked about shooting lessons. "I've seen a lot of shooters in my time," Frank would say, gesturing toward the wall where Sarah's record-setting targets were displayed. "But I've never seen anyone who understood that the real target isn't out there in the distance. The real target is the precision you build inside yourself." Sarah still worked as an engineer, but her life had expanded far beyond the boundaries that once defined it.
She spoke at conferences about applying mathematical modeling to human performance, consulted with equipment manufacturers on precision optimization, and mentored young shooters who showed promise for analytical approaches to marksmanship. But perhaps most importantly, she'd proven to herself and everyone around her that extraordinary achievement often comes from unexpected combinations. In her case, the fusion of engineering precision with athletic performance, mathematical modeling with intuitive skill, and quiet determination with spectacular execution.
The woman they'd laughed at had become the woman they studied, trying to understand how someone could achieve such impossible precision. And Sarah had learned that sometimes the best response to doubt isn't argument or explanation. It's simply hitting the target with perfect accuracy when everyone is watching. 3 shots, 45,000 meters. Perfect precision. The numbers told the story of technical achievement. But the real story was about what happens when someone combines careful preparation, mathematical understanding, and unwavering determination to pursue excellence regardless of what others think is possible. In the end, Sarah Chen didn't just hit her target. She redefined what everyone thought the target could be.